Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today we'll continue with our second section, which was about theories and hypotheses of second language learning. And we'll talk about error analysis and universal grammar. These two topics are completely different. Actually, there's two different separate topics. We'll talk about each of them. Last time we talked about contrastive analysis and cross-linguistic influence. So let's have our quick quiz as usual. First of all, what is the main obstacle to L2 learning? Which is the third level in the hierarchy of difficulty? We said we have 6 levels from level 0 to level 5. So, what is the name of the third level? What is the name for words that are derived from the same family, the same linguistic or language family? And finally, does L1 affect the transfer from L1 to L2? They are easy questions as usual, so try to write your answers in the comment section. So let's talk about error analysis first. As we talked about before, contrastive analysis said the main obstacle. Here I'm actually answering one of the questions above. So the main obstacle of L2 learning was interference. It's the main source of error. That's what contrastive analysis said. But error analysis had another idea, said that interference indeed is one of the main obstacles or main source of errors. But there's something else that we call developmental errors. So there's another source of errors which is called developmental errors. So what do I mean by developmental errors? These errors occur due to the learner's contribution in attempting to master the new linguistic system. So when the learner tries to learn the language, he makes certain errors that we call developmental errors, like overgeneralization, when they overgeneralize rule or over-apply rules when they are not applicable, like when, like we said, goad instead of went. So this structure is not in our L1 in case of Arabic, but still these type of errors are likely to happen, even if it's not in our L1. So it's not due to transfer or interference. It's from something else. Like we said, it's developmental errors. It's from our contribution to master the new linguistic system. So Corder is one of the scientists or researchers who talked about error analysis. So he said that errors are important in providing a glimpse or a hint into the learning process and how learners acquire the language or what strategies the learner is employing while learning. So these errors or mistakes, they are errors actually, not mistakes. We'll talk about the difference between them. So these errors are important for scientists and researchers to track the development or the process of language acquiring or learning for learners in case of L1 and L2. But also they came up with a term. They recognized the learner language as a true system of its own, with its regularities, and it differs in a semantic way from the native language, and they called it interlanguage. So interlanguage is the learner's language that differs in a semantic way from the native language. So they recognized it as a true system. It's like not regularity itself, like it's a system. So there are procedures or stages or steps for error analysis. There are 5. So first of all, collection of learning language. So they have a collection of learner's language through tasks, tests, quizzes, or something like that. They have a collection of his language. Then they do identification of errors. So like they first need to identify whether this error is actually an error, like it's something there is an error in his knowledge, there's a lack of knowledge, or this is like just a lapse or a mistake that happens one time. Like did he forget to use the plural s many times, so it's actually an error in his language or in his knowledge, or is it just one time, like it's a lapse or a mistake or a slip of a tongue? After they have identified the error, they need to describe the error. So is that error affects the phonology, morphology, the syntax, the grammar, what field this error affects, then the explanation of errors. Why did this error occur? Is it interference? Is from interference, or is it a developmental error? So they need to explain why did this error occur. Finally, the evaluation of error. So they evaluate to what extent this error affects comprehension. So if this learner continue forgetting to use the plural s, does it affect the comprehension? So does his like partner understand him, or like he understands what he hears? So they evaluate to what extent these errors affect the learner's communication. But of course, as every theory, it has shortcomings. So they focused on learner's error too much. The focusing on learner's errors necessarily take attention away from what learners are able to do correctly in acquiring a new language. So they focus on the errors too much. In that way, they like forget to focus on the aspects that learners are able to do. Also, learners find ways to avoid certain structures or patterns that cause them difficulty. So what do you mean by that? Like, let's take this sentence. The structures or patterns that cause them difficulty. Let's suppose that I have difficulty in this structure itself, causes them difficulty. Also, I have difficulty in writing this word, which is difficulty itself. So I'll just say that structures or patterns that are hard for them. So I avoided the fields of difficulty or the things that I can do. In that case, they can't find the error itself, like because I avoided using it. So it's like one of the shortcomings because learners used avoidance. So we have another theory now, which is universal grammar. We talked about it before. We said that it stems from a nativist view. It talks about the biological inheritance of the language, something in our system. But we have important terms that we haven't talked about before, which are competence and performance. So competence is the underlying knowledge that accounts for one's language, and performance the actual use of that competence in real life. In simple words, competence is what you know about the language, what you know of the language itself. Performance is the use of that knowledge, like the use of the language, how we use that language. It's as simple as this. Competence is about the knowledge. Performance, it's about using the language. Also, we talked about the poverty of stimulus. Like we said that language acquisition is impossible without universal grammar because the poverty of the stimulus, because the input is inadequate or insufficient. So the exposure to the input alone cannot on its own explain the abstract system of rules that characterizes the learner's language. So as we said, the exposure to the input alone cannot explain the acquiring to the language. It's the case in L1, and now we are talking about L2. Also, they say that L2 are impossible just with exposure alone. Also, learners avoid making certain kinds of errors that are logically possible. So the input alone says that there are some certain errors that we will logically be making, but sometimes we just avoid making these errors. So he says that this is the pervertive stimulus because the input alone cannot explain this. So there were different views about whether L2 learners still have access to UG or not in their second language learning. So we have three hypotheses. The first hypothesis say that L2 learners continue to have full direct access to UG, similar to the case of children learning their L1. So they say we still have access to the UG, like we were in our L1. So they use this example to support their view. So there is something that they like preposition noun, or what we call head and complement. So it comes in a certain order in It differs from languages. So we have head first and head final or head last. So head first, like in English or Arabic and even Spanish, I think, we say in Japan. So the head, which is the preposition, comes first, then the complement, which is Japan. But in Japanese, Korean, and Turkish, they say the head final, like the preposition or the head comes last. Like in Japanese, nihon ni, which means like the first one in Japan. So these alternatives, which is 1 and 2, we call them parameters. So the parameters are like a small set of alternatives of a certain grammatical aspect. So in case like in head and complement, like we have two parameters, head first and head final. We have other examples like the structure of the sentence, like SVO, VS, all these structures are also considered parameters. We can consider them as choices, actually. Like we have to choose one of them for each language. So how did they use this to support their view? They said that the Japanese native speakers who tried to learn English didn't have difficulty in acquiring the new structure which is in Japan, or head first. They didn't have difficulty in that structure, so they used this to support that like learners still have access to Yuji, like in the case of the learning alone. But the second hypothesis said that learners access Yuji indirectly through their L1. So L1 affects the access to Yuji. And they used another example to support their view. So in English, sometimes we omit the initial subject pronoun, which is I, like they say should go instead of I should go or we should go. So Spanish or Spanish native speakers who already have this structure in their language, they didn't have much difficulty accepting or learning this structure in English. But in case of French, because the French don't have this structure in its language, so French native speakers found it more harder to acquire this structure. So they use it saying that the L1 affects the access to the UG. So like we said, the omission like should go were more acceptable for Spanish speakers more than French speakers or French native speakers. The third and final hypothesis, which is second language learners no longer have access to UG. They just said like we no longer have access to UG. How did they support this view? They said like L2 learners rarely achieve native like proficiency. We talked about this before. Like we said, like even if we become fluent in our second language, it's less unlikely that we become fluent. But so they use this because it's unlikely that we become native like proficient, especially in case of pronunciation. So we may become fluent, but we can't achieve native like proficiency. So they use this to for that we no longer have access to UG, because if we still have access to the UG, we should be able to acquire L2 like we acquired our L1. So they said like learners use other mental processes instead of using UG. So there's a picture that may be easier or that explains what we talked about. So the first method said that we have direct access to UG in our L2. The second hypothesis said that we must go through our L1 to access universal grammar. So L1 affects the access to universal grammar. And finally, there's no UG access. There's other mental processes that affect the L2 learning process. So that's all we're going to talk about today. We talked about error analysis and universal grammar. They're two easy and simple topics. So thanks for watching and see you again soon, inshallah, in our next video.